is Paranormal Now, the podcast on the Inception Radio Network that airs every Saturday night at 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 8 p.m. Pacific Time. And for a lot of you who listen to this show, the format is like a radio format. That's because we are in a time slot every week and we stick to that format. So while it does sound sometimes like we are a live show, we are in fact a podcast, so that anybody listening tonight does not get confused about that, because I've had some feedback about that. Anyway, so we have a fantastic guest on tonight. I'm very excited because we actually met via the Inception Radio Network's other show, Epic Voyages Radio, which I've had the pleasure of guest hosting for and doing the technical social media work for them as well. And as usual, I want to invite anybody who is new, not only to the Inception Radio Network, but to the kind of format and the topics of discussion that we cover on this show. We cover a broad variety of, quote unquote paranormal, but that includes alternative history, and not to be confused with the alternative right. We do anything from aliens to ghosts to the most strange and bizarre stories that you've ever heard. And we always ask that you come to the table and join us around and keep an open mind as we discuss these topics, because sometimes you're going to hear something that's definitely going to sound very bizarre. It's going to sound crazy at first, perhaps. And on occasion, maybe some ideas are completely outrageous. But here we give them a chance. And we hope that if you're just getting into this format, that you give it a chance too. Just keep an open mind. Because not only is it intriguing and educational, but it's also fun at the same time. So before I rattle on too long, I'd like to introduce my guest who, let's just say he has alternative theories, and I think that's fair to say. Dan Hoquist, who has just come out with a follow-up book of his own called Book One, and I'll ask him a little bit more about accessibility to his book, whether you can get that online soon, or what's the future look like as far as publishing. But I was fortunate enough to get an early copy of this book. Granted, I have not read through it completely because we just hooked up recently, but I will read through it. And I'm excited to share about that as well moving forward. So Dan Hoquist, just a little bit of background on Dan, became a seeker of truths, with a capital T, and sometimes, quote, finder, at a very early age, introduced to various world religions, took the path of a true skeptic, and walked in the moccasins, quote, of the people. Now seeks to share knowledge gained by experience and the wisdom of more learned, in hopes that others will follow, and by passing before, make an easier path for others to follow. Longtime resident of San Gorgonia. I'm going to have to ask you how to pronounce that, actually. I don't know if that's a soft G or hard G. Gorgonio Pass, California. Graduated Banning High School. 22 years as journeyman sheet metal worker and carpenter. 16 years working with the United States Postal Service as a rural and city mail carrier, clerk, office, and sometimes supervisor. Discovered Nazca-type lines and geoglyphs on and around the Marfa, Texas plateau during the summer of 2015. After trying in vain to gain public awareness through regular channels such as Texas Archaeological Society, and even by speaking directly with the Anthropology and Archaeology Department of Texas State University, realized that nothing was going to happen if I did not get, quote, personally involved. Devotion to the truth was validated in April 2016 by a flyover, and photographic evidence was taken, and now it is made available to capital ALL all. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Alan. I really appreciate you inviting me. I wanted to directly thank you for inviting me, and I wanted to welcome you personally to the Inception Radio family. I'm a bit of a fan myself, and I come here to learn and have a bit of fun. And you know me in chat as Don Daniel. My YouTube channel is also Don Daniel. My Twitter feed is Don Daniel, @DonDaniel, and my website is dondaniel.com. On Facebook, you can reach me at Dan Hoquist. Now, this is actually the new book is actually called The Solstice Connection. It is a rework and a revision of my first book, which was titled America's Electric Nazca, Megalithic Marfa, Texas. And the reason I rewrote it is because after speaking and communicating with a few publishers, found that they did not like images, and my first book is just jam-packed full of them because I want people to replicate my work. I really think that's the heart of science itself, is through replication. But 2015 was an amazing year for discovery, and this particular discovery started with a backyard layout for a replica Stonehenge done in scale model, and I wanted to be sure that it was done right, so I brought up a blueprint of Stonehenge, and I started trying to figure out where the solstice rose and fell. And of course I knew where the winter solstice was because of we happen to live between two 12,000 foot mountains. This is called the San Gorgonio Pass, and it's a circular kind of area, which is kind of unusual in itself, but it actually separates Southern California from the desert area of Palm Springs and beyond, and on into Mexico. This particular discovery was done through finding a notch in the ridgeline. And so I played around with Google Earth, and I found through the tool function that you can layer a photograph or a picture onto the surface of the Earth and rework it. And so I had to check out how Stonehenge, the blueprint, fit over my area, and come to find out it didn't. It drew me further out and further out still until I actually left the coast of Southern California and joined with the Channel Island group. That's Santa Catalina, San Clemente, Santa Rosa, a few other islands. And these are unusual. They're about 22 miles off the coast, by the way. That's Santa Catalina itself. Unusual itself because these islands don't have anything on them. No natural water, no vegetation, no natural animals or anything of the sort. In early, well, let me take you back to the late 1800s. A German naturalist named Dr. Furstenstein was working in Mexico with the Aztecs, and he had found a story of fair-haired giants, a noble race of fair-haired giants living on Santa Catalina Island. So he went there and discovered that the stones outlining the central portion of the island, and if you can imagine this, the central portion of the island is actually circular. It's actually 22 miles long, but it's 8 miles wide at the center, and it's actually a circular formation in the center with a 2,000 foot mountain peak in the center of that. But along the outline of the island itself were these standing stones, and they matched Stonehenge, or the formation of Stonehenge in UK. So it began to be known as Stonehenge Island. A man named Ralph Glidden took that a little further and started doing excavations in the Channel Islands. On Santa Catalina, he found over 3,700 giant skeletons. And remember, there's nothing out there. There's no water. There is nothing to support life. 3,700 giant skeletons were found and taken by the Smithsonian, which brings up another 2015 fact. In 2015, the Smithsonian had to reveal that in court, that they had destroyed skeletal evidence of giants all throughout the country, that they had actually been entrusted with. So they basically had admitted to manipulation of history, of recent history, why it all comes to control. And when I started to look at Stonehenge itself, I noticed that it only had one passage in and one passage out, and that's the summer solstice. And in the central formation, there's a U formation. I happened to be listening to Zecharia Sitchin at the time, and he called the Anunnaki children of the sun. And I made a leap of faith that the people who built this megalith called Stonehenge were the Anunnaki. Well, in 2015, they also discovered elongated skulls in the Stonehenge area. And also, in 2015, discovered Superhenge. And you might know a little bit about the Superhenge, Alan. Mm-hmm. This is a formation that is actually underground standing stones that are massive. It makes the standing stone formation of Stonehenge look very small. That's why they call it a Superhenge. But I don't know why. I decided I would follow the solstice out, and guess where it leads? Right to the Superhenge. I have to feel that this is a subterranean setup at the Superhenge, because archaeologists think it was fully covered at one time. And as you travel further, you go across the ocean to Denmark, and Sweden, where there were at least 200,000 megalithic subterranean dwellings, most of which are destroyed now. This is not Vikings or Gaels. It was someone else who did this. Dolmens, mound structures, but nothing like the effigy mounds in Americas. They were mound structures. But this line carries on directly through St. Petersburg, Russia. And this is important in itself, that we'll pick up a little bit later. St. Petersburg has amazing artistry, just incredible artistry. But it was all supposed to be done before there were measuring tools, which is kind of unusual. So I decided I would take this back to Catalina and try to follow the solstice line from Catalina. Catalina connects exactly with the Grand Canyon, and then it moves on over a mountain called Navajo Mountain, which is about 10,000 feet. And then, although it's in North America, it's been largely farmed through the Midwest, there's nothing that really marks it until you get into Wisconsin. And this is Inception Radio's hometown. They're home to hundreds, if not thousands, of effigy mounds that are mostly destroyed now through farming, but one still exists today that was excavated as a stepped pyramid. It's called Fort Aztalan in Wisconsin. Moving across this area, it takes you to Mount Washington, and then further on still to Nova Scotia, which is the farthest eastern point of the North American continent. But this line carries you, if you're a treasure hunter, you have to realize how important this is. It carries you directly over Oak Island, the money pit exactly of Oak Island.
Well, that's intriguing. Yeah.
Yes, this is just another validation of that I happen to run across. Yeah.
Before you continue, first I want to thank you for welcoming me onto the Inception Radio Network, and also I realized you corrected me on the book title because I read the subtitle, not the Solstice Connection. I just read book 1, so hopefully there's going to be more books. I guess that's the plan, right?
Yeah, that's why it's called book 1. I already have book 2 outlined, and I've started to actually get the material together. That should be out next year. I have plans for a third book that might be a little more science fiction-y, speculative fiction, actually. Not really science fiction, but speculative fiction based on fact. And this is the fact that the Anunnaki are connected to the megaliths. And when I realized that I was connecting major points like the Grand Canyon, Fort Aztalan, Navajo Mountain Peak itself, Washington, the Mount Washington, and then the Money Pit. These coincidences are mathematically impossible unless it's an artificial survey.
Let's preface two things. Let's start with the Anunnaki, and let's provide a little bit more background on what we think, or what some people think the Anunnaki actually are.
Okay, well, personally, I have to think that they are the elongated skull race that has no history apparently on the Earth, because archaeologists refuse to deal with it. They're found all over the place. They've actually found some in Antarctica too, which is very, very strange, because it's supposed to have been covered by ice for hundreds of thousands of years. Of course, the Piri Reis map says different. That we'll get into a little bit later, I think. But I found a validation here in 2017, early this year, when it was raining to beat the California drought. In January, they had improved their Doppler radar so much that the topographical maps are just beautiful. But when they did that, I found a corroborating geographical feature that's simply impossible. This feature goes from San Clemente through on a solstice line that directly parallels the line that I theorized in 2015 from Catalina to the Grand Canyon. It goes exactly to the Grand Canyon. You can see traces of this on satellite imagery. Hopefully a good satellite imagery. But I found it on the weather report. And this is unusual because it's an actual national weather report. This line is impossible. It crosses at least 2 mountain ranges and over 2 continental tectonic plates, both the Pacific and the North American plates, directly at a line where the San Andreas Fault ends. Now, I know that seismologists like to think that this continues from the San Francisco Bay Area all the way through into the Baja Gulf. It doesn't. It actually stops here in the San Gorgonio Pass at a point called Kitching Peak. This solstice line, by the way, does not travel over Kitching Peak. It travels just to the west of it in a trench line, and this is how you can actually see this as a trench line from the Grand Canyon to San Clemente, over these tectonic plates, over these mountain ridges, in a perfect line without any variance. This is absolutely impossible because they say that California has been moving north for several inches a year for so long. It's not there. The fact is, there is no seismic activity after Kitching Peak. This mountain is perfectly placed where it takes the energy, the seismic energy, and transfers it both north and south around the area, and does not allow anything from the San Andreas Fault to continue to the Salton Sea. That area between the Salton Sea and Kitching Peak is a 150-mile area with absolutely no seismic activity. This was reported in 2016 on their seismic
That's
maps.
very bizarre. Yeah.
It's not possible for this line to exist. It exists on both sides of the peak. And the funny thing is, I'm personally connected to it. I didn't know this. I was actually shocked when I started looking very, very closely at this line. And you have to realize just how rural the area is. You might think Southern California is full of people, but it's not, especially in this area where the solstice line crosses. This geological anomalous feature crosses exactly through the mountain ranges, which are just now starting to have a little bit of construction. Directly through the center of Lake Elsinore, which is a man-made lake, by the way, and didn't have a whole lot of community until the lake was formed about 30, 40 years ago. I grant you that there are possibly thousands of people who have been, born and raised on this line. But when I came across the line crossing into San Gorgonio Pass, it crosses into Old Town Banning, where I grew up, and no more than about 100 feet from where I grew up for 12 years, about 200 feet from the school that I went to for elementary school, about the same for the high school. And another impossible coincidence, it crosses over the gym that my mother actually laid the cornerstone of in her high school days. She was a salutatorian. The coincidences are just staggering to me, because it tells me that that something is manipulating on a long-term basis. And the only people that involved have to be the Anunnaki. And as a skeptic, I just want to say something about skepticism, because it's a really poorly used term now. Debunkers and denialists should never be included as skeptics. They are not. They're not willing to take anything that they haven't already thought of. They've already determined their conclusions, and therefore are not skeptics. They're not scientists, and are not willing to deal with, something that is not of their own making.
Right. Well, it's different when a skeptic will the job of a skeptic is much like a scientist. It's, if you want to challenge a theory, then you have to look hard at the facts provided and the information provided.
And alternative evidence.
Doesn't do that.
Especially alternative evidence. This is why I decided that I would treat the Anunnaki as the realistic makers or builders of Stonehenge Monument. Well, that also ties to the giants. If I'm accepting one, I have to accept the other, because Stonehenge Catalina is giants. That almost 4,000 giants were dug up there. There's a funny little thing I just wanted to bring up. I didn't bring up in the book because I couldn't find information on the plaque that was found. But in Avalon Bay of Santa Catalina, which is an artificial bay that's dug out perfectly circular, and of course it's been remodeled since we've occupied it as modern humans. But there was a giant, an 8-foot giant, discovered there with a plaque with strange hieroglyphics. And if you'll remember Oak Island also had a similar plaque. And this actually ties it, because the line that crosses over Oak Island ends up crossing the very final piece of land in North America. It's an unnamed island that looks exactly like a giant footprint. Now, isn't that a nice little validation of giants on both sides of the continent, besides the dolmens that exist on the East Coast there too?
Well, I guess my question would be, especially in more recent days, if giant remains were discovered decades ago, would there not be more remains to be found And if so, I mean, you could have crews that include university interns, various scientists, and they all have phones, which now can take pictures in a split second. So
most of the archaeological work that was done in North America was actually done in the 1800s, 17s and 1800s by the newer colonists. They're the ones who dug up the effigy mounds, and they discovered giants there too. And there are notable newspaper clippings about the Wisconsin giants, especially in the Fort Aztlan area, and their tie is directly to the Gulf of Mexico, where they found seaweed apparently draping a princess. They called it the seashell princess, I believe. She was found in a very ornate dress of seashells, and this is a giant woman, by the way. This, I believe, you can still see in the museum of Fort Aztlan, or Aztlan, Wisconsin. But the seaweed comes from the Gulf of Mexico, and that doesn't surprise me, because in Texas they also found giants too, down at the Gulf of Mexico. And on a northern line from that, you had the Cahokia Mounds, which are basically a pyramidal setup that was excavated and then refilled in because the indigenous Indian people took control of the area. So you do have megaliths in North America. Just everything has been repackaged. There's nothing that's really shows the ancient peoples of America. They want you to believe that Indians are Mongols, but that the genetics just don't show that.
They don't show that, right? Yeah, I guess. But my question was, if now we find a team of archaeologists find a giant skeleton or remains, how do they hide that?
They don't. Actually, they have been reporting some findings, like
tall, it's very tall people, right?
We've been very, very fortunate in recent days just to have information on the new mummies found in Nazca, because the government, the Peruvian government, has now taken over. They want to be like Egyptologists. They want to control all the information that comes out of Peru, especially the Nazca area.
All right, well, Dan, let's hold it there. We're going to our first break. You're listening to Paranormal Now on the Inception Radio Network. My guest is Dan Hoquist, and we will be right back. Welcome back to Paranormal Now on the Inception Radio Network, your weekly podcast. I'm your host, Alan B. Smith, and tonight's guest is Dan Hoquist. And taking us out of the break is Bob Marley, Buffalo Soldier. So Dan, I want to get back, before we continue on with the story as we have been going, could you just take a moment to explain what Oak Island is to those who are new to the story of Oak Island?
Oak Island is another artificially formed island. If you look at it from a satellite image, it looks like an elephant or possibly a mammoth. But it's not the only artificially formed island. The thing about Oak Island is its connection to both the Templars, or apparent connection to the Templars, I should mention, because they haven't found anything actually linking them, except for several old coins that date into the 1700s. They found some weird radiation in the money pit originally. When they tried to carbon test some of the wood there, it came up as future dates, and that's a little odd. This is not abnormal though, because radiocarbon dating has this ability to really be bad for dating some things, and it didn't like this wood apparently. But they dug down some 3 children, I believe, in their teens, had found a pulley over a pit area off of an oak tree, and they decided to dig there, thinking there was treasure, and they actually found a few things, but they found every 10 foot was another level of rounded logs, and ended up with they found coconut, and coconut is not natural to this hemisphere, much less and much less the island area of Nova Scotia. But they've actually kept going. Every 10 foot they found this logged off area, but on one of them, about 90 foot down, they found a plaque with hieroglyphics, and that I wish I could find out more information about the plaque found on the giant in Catalina, but I believe they're the same kind of hieroglyphs, which kind of it kind of eliminates the Templar connection to Oak Island, but it's also connected to the earliest. Christopher Columbus had additional captains with him, and one of the boats, there's a missing piece of time, and this is, according to the stories, this is the point where this boat went, and that was to hide certain artifacts, and this has not been actually validated though, although
do you really think the matching glyphs between the 2 points discludes the Knights Templars, or might the Knights Templars have been using something that was passed down?
Actually, this is all passed down. The Knights Templars are who we call the Masons now. The Masons gladly take on that amulet too. They consider themselves Templars. They actually this comes from one of the first mystery schools of Egypt, and that's the Temple of Luxor. Is considered the first Masonic temple, and you'll notice that every Masonic temple has these columns, 2 columns on the entry door. Well, that's supposed to emulate the obelisks that were in front of the Temple of Luxor. But there were other mystery schools too. And I just want to ask you, Alan, you're aware that latitude and longitude are a fairly new device. How do you think people actually navigated for 190,000 years, give or take 500?
We know for a fact that people sailed using the stars just by memory.
Exactly. This is actually the Greeks actually they detailed this particular kind of navigation in the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, by using the constellations and the position of the sun. They were able to accurately move around the world. There's a story of a Greek named Pythias, a mariner who knew exactly where Stonehenge was, and this dates to at least the 3rd century, which is kind of unusual because the Arthurian legend of Stonehenge it dates to the 5th. But 2015, all the discoveries, they actually found up to 15 lower structures in the Stonehenge mound, or in the circle. In other words,
now, weren't some of those
thousands of years older. It's much older than they even imagine now. But Pythias knew exactly how to find this. Yeah.
Do you remember, were they all, was it stone, or were there not wood
There
hedges underneath.
there is some evidence of wooden posts used along the same lines as the Superhenge. By the way, they think that they used the wooden posts and then covered the whole Superhenge on top of those pillars, those columns, using them using it as a subterranean housing. I believe it's actually an underground Stonehenge. Same size blue stones are found along the edge, but they're buried at the Superhenge.
So if you think, in that case, would it have been possible that they actually had ceremonies underground?
Absolutely.
That's what this was for. It's like a safe place for ceremonies. Yeah.
But it goes even deeper than that. They've found very recently that a lot of these standing stones have markings on them that are meant to be seen at night, which means they glowed. And now, how is that possible? Well, I think I found the answer, to tell you the truth. But this I'll have to take you through. We were talking about Pythias and how he knew where the Stonehenge monument was from Greece. He didn't travel overland. He used water navigation. So these anthropologists, thinking that men were too afraid or didn't have the knowledge to cross open water, just they're dismissing the actual evidence. And this comes to the Antikythera machine, by the way. This was found in the 1960s in a shipwreck off of Greece, and it's about a 6-inch device made of about 30 or so cogs that are exactly machined to interact with each other. And what it is an analog computer of the constellations, or the movement of the constellations, just like an astrologer would do nowadays with a computer program. That's amazing to me. This dates to at least 100 BC, which means that they were operating on even older knowledge. And this is all learned in the mystery schools of Egypt. The original mystery school of Egypt being the Temple of Osiris. And there is a stone that anybody can go visit today. You can look it up online. A stone that they would like to think is etched, but they really have no idea how this thing was marked. It is the symbol of the flower of life, the geometric, sacred geometry symbol of the flower of life. And apparently, this is what they used for navigation, was the constellations and the position of the sun, especially on the solstice. That's when the day stands still, or the sun stands still. That's the actual literal meaning of the solstice, solstice, the day the sun stands still.
I think you make a really good point with the Antikythera machine, because we know that knowledge used is, no matter how groundbreaking or advanced it is, or who the genius is behind it, is based on previous knowledge. So
exactly,
this device, it's surprising enough that it's as old as it is. All that means is that there was a series of individuals that preceded this and passed knowledge down and built upon that knowledge. So yeah, I agree, especially since we know how Samoans even today can, though there are not many left, I don't believe, that can actually navigate using just their eyes. But this idea that humans were afraid of the waters, were afraid and not clever enough, it is pretty absurd. And if we were actually human beings, essentially with the brains that we have for, let's just say 1 million years, that's a pretty acceptable number even in mainstream academia. So it's very hard to believe that for hundreds of thousands of years we didn't use that brain. So to me, it does make sense that we were out all over this earth, far earlier than history tells us. And every year, more discoveries are made that push the mainstream history back by 1,000 years or 5,000 years, and it's getting bigger and bigger. So I kind of feel like this ancient history that may sound ridiculous to some people today as we speak, won't sound outrageous in 10 years from now.
And really, academia wants you to believe in one of two theories: the out of Africa theory, or the multi-regional continuity theory. And both of those don't explain the migratory patterns. In the out of Africa theory, this is the one that most people refer to. They would like you to believe that everybody is related to an evolution that moved out of Africa and up through the coastlines and across some kind of land bridge that only happened during the Ice Age into North America. But the problems with this are the haplogroups which say they were here. There is no genetic line past haplo X. That means haplo X is the dominant genetic feature of the people on this continent. Everybody else happened to interbreed with other races, especially the Chinese on the California coast. We found plenty of ancient Chinese anchors off the California coast, and in the Yucatan, there's actually been yin-yang symbols found, which is really kind of neat. It means that these people crossed great oceans with no problem, and I know now that they used this particular symbol called the flower of life. If you look at the Great Pyramid, this is the point where the Piri-Reis map is actually centered. The Piri-Reis map, they want you to believe, was made in the 1500s, about 100 years before they started with latitude and longitude, because latitude and longitude are not marked on the Piri-Reis. What is marked is this emanating solar pattern, a rayed pattern from the center of the Great Pyramid in Giza and other spots. And Plato, the Greek, actually thought there were 120 of these nodes around the world. He considered the world a living crystal, which is kind of neat, because now the newest science is actually saying that the center of the earth is not this molten core of iron, but actually linear crystal that is magnetic, linear magnetic crystal. And that matches more. It matches more of what we were told by the Sumerians 10,000 years ago.
How do you mean linear crystal?
Linear magnetic. In other words, it only has like one pole, and they're actually poled along line areas like the north-south. Okay, this the people who would like to think that we had some kind of catastrophe that moved the equator of the earth or shifted the poles or something like that. Magnetic poles, I don't think it would matter. It wouldn't cause a catastrophe. But if it ever did, all of the math at Giza would be wrong today, which it's not in evidence. The math at the Great Pyramid works because there has been no movement of the Earth. But the Piri-Reis map also shows Antarctica free of ice. This is supposed to come from very, very old sources. But it uses
the Piri-Reis math,
Giza.
If I may interject really quick, the Piri-Reis math, for those who don't know, is from around, I believe, 1500, right?
Yeah, they want you to believe that, but it's from older sources.
Right. So, and what the evidence that the map provides to indicate that it's from an older source, or it drew information from an older source, is the features on the map were essentially unidentifiable at the time, correct?
Yes, and it also shows that the positions of North and South America, but it's in a weird kind of orientation, and this is because it's oriented on the Great Pyramid of Giza. Now, here's a little fun evidence that you can do yourself. If you imagine looking down on the Great Pyramid. It's made of this square, and and you can actually draw lines across the apex from corner to corner. Okay, now if you draw a circle around the base with all of the base points in the circle touching, and then you circle each face of the Great Pyramid, you make a flower of life symbol. You start it right there. So this is why I say we were using the flower of life symbology. And come to find out, when I tried later, I overlaid a pattern of the flower of life over the Stonehenge blueprint, and they match precisely. So all of this great math that we get at Stonehenge, they didn't have to know. All they had to know was a circle, the flower of life symbol, and it's basically a perfectly divided circle. This is the same line that Sir Francis Bacon drew to the new colonies. And he apparently had information from the early Spanish conquistadors of Mexico City looking a lot like Atlantis. It was a canal city, centrally dry, surrounded by water, and a lot of people aren't aware how closely it resembles Atlantis. Outside of Mexico City, it's proper is Tiwanaku. That's where the Pyramid of the Sun is, and funny thing about the Pyramid of the Sun, it's not a north-facing pyramid. Researchers have been telling people that it's a north-facing pyramid. It is not. It is a solstice-facing pyramid. Now, this is what happened when I started drawing lines from the Great Pyramid. Is I drew one line, and amazingly, from the northwest corner across the apex to the southwest corner, it matches exactly with the altar of Stonehenge. And then it comes into the Americas, and it crosses over Lake Michigan, where there have been pyramids apparently found in the water, and exactly over the mound structure that I spoke of in Wisconsin, the pyramid, the stepped pyramid of Fort Aztlan. And on in through the Americas, it leads to Texas. Now, this particular place is Marfa, Texas. And Marfa, Texas, you might know of as the place where phantom lights have been seen for about close to 200 years now. Although one particular piece of research was done out there. It's not enough to really call research. They had some students from the archaeology department of the Texas University go out and sit at the Marfa Viewing Center, and they concluded, I think they had concluded before they went out there, that all the lights were car lights on roads. Well, it discounts all of the anecdotal evidence. There was the original person who reported this was a cowboy named Robert Ellis. In 1883, he chased these lights thinking they were Apache campfires, and of course didn't catch them, and that's where the original story comes from. But later, during World War II, they had an air base there, an Army air base, uh, which later became the viewing center, the Marfa viewing center. This particular base had the function of training these pilots who did some night flights, etc. They were almost crashing to the ground because they were chasing these lights. The archaeology students just didn't even bother with that evidence at all. This is from our government sources, by the way. So the lights are real. They are a phenomena. I believe they're an electrical phenomena. But what happened when I started really looking at all these lines I had been following, like everybody has heard of the line that connects Easter Island with Machu Picchu, with the Great Pyramid. Well, yeah, it also connects to this what archaeologists have grudgingly accepted as a real geological artifice. In other words, an artificial geological anomaly in the middle of, well, I should say the west of the Sahara. It's an eye that's oriented on this line, and this line crosses exactly over the pupil. And I say pupil of the eye because geologists had to grudgingly accept this, that each of these circular formations are made of different soil that were artificially brought in and formed circularly to make this appearance. When you look at it from altitude, it looks like an eye. Anyway, that connects with the west wall of the Great Pyramid at Giza. It exits on the over the apex and slightly off of the east side. See, with the flower of life symbology, it doesn't really take east and west is not that important, but the angles automatically follow solstice lines, both winter and summer solstice lines on the Great Pyramid. Any north-facing pyramid has automatic solstice lines, and that's all due to this flower of life effect, which apparently went all over the earth. This is what they use for navigation.
It is for the purposes of the book. I know that you said that there are so many images, and that if you packed all those images into a book, then you could never get it published because it would just be page after page of images.
I found that out the hard way.
Yeah. Oh, someone said that to you?
Yeah, well, actually, yes. The publisher said, you're going to have to reduce the number of images by about all of them. So that's why this upcoming book doesn't have a whole lot of images.
That's the whole point. Right. The images are everything.
I really wanted people to be able to follow this. So what I'm doing is I'm now transferring all of my research onto my Facebook, my website, and, of course, the YouTube I've had going for some time now. But all of my research is on there. The flight pictures of the Marfa Plateau, if you're interested, is a 7-part series called Texas Electric Nazca. And that details all of the validation that I did personally on my flyover of the Marfa area. But I wanted to explain the electric part. When I was traveling all over the world using these solstice lines, I started looking very closely at the land under which these lines were following. And they, especially in the uninhabited areas, there were these large areas of land that were outlined, apparently purposely, that looked like Mayan construction. And other researchers call this polygonal construction. So when I was, this is a validation when I was crossing these solstice lines, whether or not they were local navigation or a worldwide navigation, was whether they crossed over these areas. And I got into this one area of the Gobi Desert in China where there's literally nothing. There's nothing out there. And of course I found the areas of land that were outlined. But there was an anomaly, and I zoomed in on it, and it's this water plant that the Chinese have set up. And this water plant I zoomed in on is hooked to a water plant that both was pushing water into the water plant, but it was also pushing water into these canals they had dug up alongside the outline areas that I spoke of, these polygonally outlined areas. They went for hundreds of miles, all of them dug up beside, but they had, upon close inspection, they were pumping water up these canals, and at one point they start powering up. They become visibly a light, and where the water ends, the electricity still continues up these lines.
What?
These
When you
lines
say
are for
power of what? What's charging the
conduction.
Okay.
This is apparently a geological hydroelectric plant. This is an ancient form of creation of electricity. And if you think
Dan,
that
let's hold it right there.
didn't have electricity, sure.
Dan, I hate to cut you off. We're going to go on a break. We'll pick it up right there with lines, electricity, and ancient history. Paranormal Now will be right back. To Paranormal Now, this is Alan B. Smith, your host on the Inception Radio Network. My guest tonight is Dan Hoquist, and we are talking about ancient history. Taking us out of the break was White Flag by Dido. And for anybody listening on the Inception Radio Network, if you want to expand beyond the website and get tapped into IRN more often, then you can go to the Inception Radio app, which can be found on your app in your iPhone or on your Android or anywhere really. And you can also listen to the show live 365. You can listen to it on Stitcher Radio, Nobex Radio, TuneIn, iTunes Radio, Streama, Shoutcast, Winamp, WinMedia Player, and QuickTime, as well as Roku channel. Just go to the IRN Roku channel and add that to your channel list. Also, if you are ever in need of listening to a specific guest, a show, and you're having trouble with your internet, you can always call 401-283-6700 from your cell phone or landline, and you can listen to the Inception Radio Network live feed for free. And of course, this being a podcast, you can download every episode that you missed on the Paranormal Now page on the Inception Radio Network. And if you want to find out more about upcoming shows and recent broadcasts, just go to Paranormal Now Radio on Facebook, and we will be publishing there as well as on Instagram, and that is at Paranormal Now. And getting back to the now, Dan Hoquist. Dan, we were talking about these lines in China and the electricity. Can you just pick it up and take us away from that?
Yes. Yeah, well, we're still in the Gobi Desert, mind you. These lines are shown to actually continue this electrical generation of power through these canals. They've apparently connected lights on the lines themselves, the outline themselves of this that I told you about, that outline the areas polygonally. And just like Mayan construction looks, it's very, very strange thing to see from satellite imagery. But these lines, these canals, although not containing water, are still generating electricity up the line, and that can be seen with these little lights that they've set up along the outlines. But when I pulled back, when I zoomed out, I noticed that the land underneath was actually being lit up in these stream fashion. In other words, it's not a real something you could say was a light bulb. It looked more like water draining. So I have to associate that with what they were doing, generating this electricity up these geological formations, which I believe are quartz. And this is not the only time that we have proof of ancient electrical generation. In the 70s, there's a Hindu chemist who happened to be reading one of the newly discovered Vedas, which described a king levitating his throne. And the more he read, the more he realized he was reading a chemical battery. The chemical battery was so impressive to him that he had the Veda actually read into the Chemical Institute, their minutes, which is just amazing. So it sits there in permanent record now. But if you think of the Baghdad batteries, this is more what's happening in the Gobi Desert to me, is that they were actually using an acidic water and connecting it, by crystal apparently. And to research this, I ran right into a guy named John Hutchison. He's a bit of an eccentric inventor from Canada who is better known for the Hutchison effect, which he's levitated bowling balls. He's caused metal to catch on fire. Strange
and those videos
things
are
happen.
actually on YouTube, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But he doesn't keep records real well. The work that he did with crystal shows that if you attach an electrical device, an electrical output to quartz crystal, it lights up like a light bulb. And this is very important because there's no sign of any kind of burning torches or candles in the Pyramid Giza area. And that shows another connection, which means that somehow that they were lit up using quartz. And if you get into the actual research on Giza, you find out that it has a high quartz content in all of the rocks. And all of the rocks are somehow different, like the use of rose granite. The obelisks themselves are all different material. They're not the same. And I believe that they were actually something like a street light. They were supposed to, according to the Egyptian archaeology, they say that the obelisks contain the power of Ra. This is what the Templars grasped upon, and they actually took these obelisks from around Egypt and started setting them up on this line from Jerusalem into France and England itself. There are obelisks sitting in both London and Paris, France. And this is the connection of the Masonic order, the line that continues from Stonehenge and is documented as the line that you can see from space, that is a straight line from cities of Atlanta, Washington D.C., Boston, and New York. These are all, New York has one of these obelisks in Central Park, by the way, but this line passes not over the obelisks, but through the center of them. In other words, like where London is located and Paris are located, the line passes through the center. The Templars apparently wanted to make their own connection to New Jerusalems that they tried to build in France and again in London, and were successful at Washington, D.C. I took a Stonehenge layer from the Capitol, and the reason I did this is because it's actually the Belt of Orion. When you look at the Capitol, the White House itself, out to the Washington Monument, or the man-made obelisk at Washington D.C., the center and the line actually deviates. There are three circles, and it deviates towards the Orion's belt. So I took this layer from the center of that setup, and it meets exactly with the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. That is the connection they apparently were trying to do all that time, from the time that the Templars opened up Jerusalem and found this knowledge. And apparently they thought that by putting the obelisk, they were bringing the power of Ra, but they didn't realize that the power was actually connected underneath the obelisk. The obelisk was basically a street light, and possibly it vibrated or hummed. I don't know. I have to imagine that a clean Giza would be just multicolored and humming, especially with activity. But continuing into Marfa, Texas itself, I found these polygonal areas were outlined, and I decided I would highlight them to make it easier to see. It led to an area where these areas, the land areas connected, that was set up to look like a cross, and not just any cross, but a Gaelic cross. And that was used for navigation purposes too. If you remember, that circular center of the Gaelic cross was actually movable, and it represented the constellations. And when they pointed the cross itself towards the North Star at night, they could match the constellations and know exactly where they were. This is a similar device as to what the Muslims were using to cross through the vast oceans of sand in the Sahara. They actually owned that area as the Ottoman Empire by using a simple tool that's like a fan with 9 strings, and they would actually knot these strings where the constellations were at night, and then they would set it with the sun in the morning with this fan spread. That was a navigational tool called the Kamal, I believe, and that was in use with all the way from ancient Egypt. The solar religions are the first religions in the world. But getting back to the electricity, now what I found was that here's this cross section, but it's actually made like a connector. And then there was a line from that area with these
Dan,
apparent arrows.
Dan, where are you taking us back to this cross section?
This is in Marfa, Texas, on the Marfa Plateau.
Okay.
Now, the Marfa Plateau, I believe, is noted for its lights. This is an electrical phenomena out there. It was intended to be lit up, just like the lines were in the Gobi Desert. And, to verify this, I actually went out to Nazca and looked around on the satellite imagery, which is really obfuscated. But there are sections where apparently these lines are still functioning that are actually exhibiting the same kind of electrical output as the lines in Gobi. So I believe this is all connected, that Nazca itself was lit up from underneath. Nazca is famous for its quartz. It has a quartz cap. And again, if you have an acidic aquifer and the connective possibilities of quartz itself, which John Hutchison has shown in his work, it really simplifies things as a navigational tool for the Anunnaki. They came to a dark world, and the first thing they did was they set up these areas that could continue producing electrical lighting without their continuous monitoring. In other words, like a closed loop geohydroelectric system where the acidic water would actually power the electrical phenomena, and that's a cold plasma. It's not a hot plasma, it's a cold plasma. This would be invisible during the day, but still continuing. And this also happens in any kind of Baghdad battery. The Baghdad battery is all you really need is anything acidic, and it'll give you 1.5 volt. That's the same as a little square battery. It just amazes me that people think we didn't have this in ancient times.
It is funny to think that, because just going through grade school, we could get electricity out of a potato.
Exactly.
So photons, electricity, energy in its many forms is in everything. And some of those natural things it's easier to tap into that energy, and if we could do that with the most basic of instruments, I can accept that.
This is a free energy. This is actually a free energy.
Well, that's what Tesla was chasing, and that was only 100 years ago, and he was a genius for his time. And I guess, of course, if it wasn't for J.P. Morgan pulling out his funding, we might actually live in a different world.
Exactly.
And he was doing exactly that. He was trying to tap into the natural energy that just is, and scientists don't deny that it's there, because we do it in science class. I think they just have a hard time accepting that it was done on a larger scale, with prehistory mankind.
And you have to wonder if the ancient alchemists, the Hermetics that were using these ancient Egyptian systems, actually, if they actually had electricity, we might even be a different world now too. This is it boggles the mind. But this science was not ours. This science belonged to someone else who knew how to use it. And the crystal, the quartz itself, being a conductive capacitor, even now they're using it for memory storage, because it has unlimited memory storage. But going back to Plato, he thought the whole world was a living crystal, and you could actually speak with the world's soul at some of these nodal points like Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, Giza Pyramid itself, and this, of course, the Emerald Tablets of Thoth say the same thing, exactly the same thing.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to imagine. I mean, Jules Verne, Journey to the Center of the Earth, crystals, and they were generating electricity, and this is how they had light in this subterranean atmosphere. And I do want to ask you, I meant to ask you earlier, what is the recent evidence that suggests that the center of the Earth may not really be molten iron?
This was very recently done by physicists who, even though we know that gravity and pressure actually create heat,
enormous pressure,
but it does funny things. It makes rock plasticine, and if you've seen the Mayan walls, you see these puckered areas. This was probably done by gravity and pressure to actually mold these things to make them plasticine. This was evidenced in the Kola deep borehole that was done from the 70s to the 90s in Russia. They found a few very unusual things, like oil is not fossil fuel. It's not connected. No way. It never has been. It's found at about over twice the level of the oldest fossil. And that's another thing about fossils too. The oldest fossil they found in there was plankton that almost looks exactly the same as it does now. And according to Darwin, we should be talking to it by now. It did not evolve, just as we have not evolved for 200,000 years, no matter what notables like David Wilcock or Graham Hancock want to imply. There has been no notable improvement of the human species. And really, if you look at the evolution of the world, well, things don't evolve; they actually get smaller. If the dinosaurs are birds now, it just gets smaller. But the great creatures still exist under pressure in the oceans. Coelacanths, huge whales, great crocodiles are still roaming the seas. And who knows what else, because we can't get down there.
I think that's a good point. I mean, was gravity, was stronger, and that's what made things bigger. So it would make sense that we would shrink as gravity lessens.
Well, it actually comes to the Sumerian Chronicles itself. It tells of the Anunnaki becoming adapted to this gravity and not being able to return to Nibiru. Nibiru, according to Zecharia Sitchin, is 3 to 5 times the mass of Earth. In other words, bigger. Any people coming from there would be incredibly strong. They would have eyes probably developed for subterranean, because apparently they had radiation problems with the atmosphere of Nibiru, which is why they came here for the gold. And these paths, especially from the Great Pyramid, solstice paths, from the megaliths that connect one to the other. This is precise, by the way. All the megaliths are connected by solstice lines, whether it be winter or summer solstice. They're interchangeable, because at some point over the Earth they change into their opposite. In other words, a winter line becomes a summer line. So they're equally as important, but they come to points like these nodes that Plato talked about. But it looks more like the Union Jack flag of the British. That's the vertex. It's amazingly connected. Everything in this Earth seems to be manufactured. So natural sciences, of course, are starting with incorrect data. So they're going to be getting wrong results, and which is why we have dating problems with all the dating systems.
Sure, but as far as physics go, I mean, the math is pretty good there, and I mean, it is all connected to some degree.
Right.
We use
apparently
the math of physics to measure time.
Apparently, iron would not maintain a solid form enough. It would become gaseous, apparently, at the heats of the center of the Earth. So now physicists are actually saying that, well, it's not a molten core of metal that the Earth is. It's actually crystalline. And if you'll notice, quartz is the most abundant product on the Earth. This Earth is, or was, and a very a living thing, or electric, if you will. Going back to Texas, though, when I told you about the line that I drew from the Grand Canyon area, well, the Grand Canyon I used as the altar of Stonehenge on a layer of Stonehenge, and the winter solstice line also meets at Marfa, Texas. So we have not only one validation from the Great Pyramid, but we have a second validation from the Grand Canyon itself. And I thought I'd just throw a couple of things in there. Do you know about Adam's calendar? in South Africa. Michael
Mm.
Tellinger, he calls it Enki's calendar. It's perhaps
I'm
the
familiar
oldest
with Michael
version.
Tillinger. I don't recall. Okay.
It's perhaps the oldest version of a Stonehenge-like calendar system. It's done exactly the same as Stonehenge, but this I connected exactly to the center of this structure in South Africa, to the center of the south face of the Giza pyramid, the Great Pyramid of Giza. And if you go over the north side, that leads you into Turkey and through Ukraine, Russia's, and it meets with the solstice line from Stonehenge at St. Petersburg. You remember me telling you about that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, when you take this line directly over the North Pole, it only crosses one piece of land. It comes close to Svalbard, coming up over it, but coming back down through the Pacific, it crosses over Alaska in a particular area about 50 miles, maybe 30 miles west of Mount McKinley. This is important because Linda Moulton Howe has been talking with a whistleblower, military whistleblower, about finding a pyramid in exactly that area. And I did not include this in the book, so you get it first on your radio show. These lines connect exactly like they do at the Giza Pyramid in the center of the Pacific Ocean. In other words, you have, if you think of the Great Pyramid of Giza being called the center of all land, well, its opposite nexus is the center of all waters. And if you have a good satellite imagery, you can see there's something that might be a pyramid right
It's fascinating.
in that same area. Isn't that something?
That is amazing.
The connections are just impossible without being artificial. That they connect in Marfa, Texas, means that we actually have a megalithic structure that has to be the biggest archaeological find in North America. The square mile area of the Marfa Plateau itself is about 100, maybe 150 miles square, and these lines continue all the way through the Big Bend area and into Mexico itself, where you'll recognize the Zona del Silencio and a particular city that was strangely abandoned, that shows modern technology, plumbing, etc., but 4 different kinds of building techniques and strange lopsided T doorways. They were apparently the indigenous people think that there's some kind of a doorway to another dimension that their gods came through, and that's Paquime in Chihuahua. This all connects with a line taken from the Pyramid of the Sun. Remember, I told you that it was not a north-facing pyramid? Using that from corner to corner over the apex directly takes you exactly to this area in Chihuahua where Paquime is. And if you take a solstice line from there, it takes you to Chaco Canyon. If you take a solstice line from Chaco Canyon, which is built structurally circular, it takes you exactly to that pyramid at Fort Aztlan again. Fort Aztlan. I get the words mixed up because the Aztec creation myth includes Aztlan, that they came from this place in the north, which was an island surrounded by water, and they called it Aztlan. But the people of Chaco Canyon said that they were told by their gods to build there. There's nothing there. There's no local water. Everything had to be brought in.
Right,
this
Dan,
was done.
Let's hold it there. We're on our
Sure.
third and last break. Our guest tonight is Dan Hoquist, talking about alternative ancient history, or maybe not so alternative, as the facts begin to catch up with this story. You can find out more about Dan at DONDANL. That's DonDanel.com. This is Alan B. Smith for Paranormal Now, and we'll be right. This is Paranormal Now. I'm your host, Alan B. Smith. Welcome back to the fourth and final segment of this podcast. Again, as a friendly reminder, because I haven't really been on top of this very much, and people have made some comments about it, the format of the show is in a live stream format every Saturday night, but it is recorded as a podcast, so technically we are a podcast, but because we have our time constraints, we have to treat it exactly like a radio show. So I don't want any of y'all to be too confused or think that this is a replay of another show. So my guest is Dan Hoquist. We are talking about a fascinating topic. We've covered so much territory so far, I can't even recap at this point, other than the fact that there are connections throughout ancient history that Dan has, and pun is intended, drawn the lines for us to understand the intercontinental connection that has possibly existed well beyond history as we are taught, or as the mainstream historians believe it to be. But again, I have to say that I feel like in recent years, the archaeological community, the history that we are told by them is changing. And I think because some of the evidence is becoming to be undeniable, and they simply can't turn a blind eye continuously to artifacts and discoveries that are made. So begrudgingly, science, yeah, sometimes it does move slowly, and maybe that's a good thing, because that gives people time to really thoroughly analyze the evidence. But at the same time, you also get people who are biased in their field, and because they believe that the work has been done. And then someone like Dan comes along and says, well, no, you missed this. And if you're an academic, you don't want someone coming along and telling you that you, who have been studying something for decades, missed something, if you're supposed to be an expert. So I think that as good as many archaeologists are as scientists, it is hard to have your life's work challenged. So I have sympathy in that regard. But the fact is, you have to let the ego go eventually and challenge yourself. So I welcome Dan onto Paranormal Now, so we continue talking about his story and his discoveries.
And as a scientist, you have to be able to follow the evidence. Instead, if you find yourself denying a piece of evidence, then especially without any research, then you are not committing science. You're committing fraud. You're committing your own opinion. But anyway, I wanted to get back to the why exactly they use these straight lines. And now this actually connects to the recent phenomena of UFOs. A man named Amy Michelle back in the 1950s determined that the UFOs were actually using a straight line pattern. And later he teamed up with another person who ran a computer program, and it apparently matches the nodal form of the flower of life that I've been talking about, which is another validation, but it comes from a much more present source. These UFOs are apparently the Anunnaki, and they might be back. This is something that might be troubling, except at some point they got enough gold, or they might have even been able to make their own gold, because what they started calling the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, or Hermes Trismegistus, was the Philosopher's Stone. And this is something the alchemists had searched for to change lead into gold, or other metals into gold, to transmute from one substance to another. That was the purpose of alchemy. And apparently the Anunnaki either got enough gold, or they found out how to actually make it. And this, I think they probably learned through the electrical discharge known as plasma, because what you learn in school are three forms of matter: solid, liquid, and frozen. Gaseous, put it that way: solid, liquid, and gaseous. But there's actually a fourth form of matter, and that's plasma. And any physicist will tell you after the Big Bang, there was a time of plasma. Plasma is mutable. You can make anything, and that's what the universe is made out of. We are the stuff of stars. But what the lines were for, I had to think about. These straight lines that they were using, and apparently they needed them aerially. When they cross over mountain peaks, if you were doing a survey, you wouldn't know what's on the other side. But they didn't care. They used the mountain peak itself as dead reckoning, which is the earliest form of aviation that we know of. You know, our early aviators used dead reckoning. They used visual mountain peaks, etc. Anything that could be picked up from aerially. There were only two things that I could come up with. Either they had these straight line patterns for communication, or they had to transport. And because I was thinking of Anunnaki, I had to think of gold, the transport of gold. For each of these lines, they all connect megalithic temples, shrines around the world to at least one pyramid or a pyramidal structure. And I say pyramidal structure because they also use mountains as pyramidal structures also. And you can verify this by Mount Kailash itself, the forbidden mountain in the Himalayas. Apparently, recent Chinese papyrus actually shows that this mountain might be an electrical generator of some sort, or a weapon. And then this mountain is 20,000 feet in elevation. So really, you know, you have to think that they had science on a much higher level. But because of the weight of gold, when they were actually going from shrine to shrine, they had to have a place. And that's where I think they developed this pyramid, using a pyramid as a vault, apparently, or a refinery. A lot of this is not my theory. It comes from an earlier theory that pyramids were used to refine gold with, especially like the step pyramids down in South America. They look like washboards. There's been a lake of mercury found under the Pyramid of the Sun, and mercury is really, it's connected directly to gold refinery. But that makes the Great Pyramid the destination. That's why all these lines come from the Great Pyramid. They would take this refined gold, I believe, to the Great Pyramid, and there it would be made into monatomic gold. And if you think of the coffer inside the king's chamber, this is exactly, the interior size is exactly the dimensions given in the Bible of the Ark of the Covenant. Huh. The Ark of the Covenant is basically a monatomic gold apparatus, and this they were apparently eating it, calling it manna, on the exodus of the Jews from Egypt. It actually could have been the Hebrews actually may have come from Samaria instead, but that's another story. Really, it tells about Moses being so angry that the people had taken their gold and formed it into a golden calf, which is, by the way, a sun symbol. And he took that golden calf and forced the Hebrews to eat it. Now, how do you do that unless you change it?
Gold, right?
Yeah. Monatomic gold has some really interesting qualities. It's actually perfect for the Anunnaki. If you think that they had to use an aerosolized gold to somehow protect their atmosphere from radiation, and this is what I believe they were doing, is they were setting it to reflect, setting this monotopic gold in the atmosphere to reflect radiation. They did not apparently have the Van Allen belts that we have, and that's another thing to think of when you think about the Earth as an artificial, or at least a terraformed planetary object, as the Sumerians chronicled in the Enuma Elish, that the Anunnaki actually set this into this orbit, exact orbit. And when you think about, we've got an upcoming eclipse, full eclipse coming in North America. The moon is the perfect size to cover the sun, exactly for that coronal corona of the sun to show, and nothing else. That's impossible. It's really impossible. And this has been noted by noted physicists like Isaac Asimov himself, who very, very blatantly said there are better reasons to think of the moon as an artifice than a natural product. And the mass doesn't match the gravity. They had incredible problems even targeting the moon with the early NASA, because of the mass not matching the gravity. The gravity itself is only about a sixth of the Earth's gravity, which makes the moon apparently hollow. And they allowed one of the command modules to impact the surface of the moon just to test that, and it rang for like 24 hours, like a bell.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
This is a quote.
Well, I think, wasn't the argument that that it must be made of like a porous material, rock-like material deeper down, and then that was the explanation for why it rang and why its mass is lighter?
The newest one is that it's full of water.
Oh,
okay.
Huh.
Yeah.
So we're doing more water now than
yeah.
Okay.
See, if you think of water as being the substance of life, well, the Kola deep borehole also showed that water is a natural product of gravity and pressure. What's happening at a certain depth is that hydrogen molecules and oxygen molecules are being forced together. Without any explosion, no explosion. It just being pushed together by pressure to form water. In other words, any place, any planetary object in the heavens that has hydrogen and oxygen in the atmosphere will have water at a certain depth and form it in aquifers, just like it does on Earth. So really, life can exist anywhere. Especially because you know that gravity and pressure also create warmth. So really, there's no such thing as a Goldilocks zone. Really, space is cold. We found that out on the very first Mercury launches, putting men in orbit. Their hands were getting cold because the spacesuits didn't have air circulation around the fingers. They thought they could use something like a regular glove. Oh no. anything from the sun, any heat from the sun, is actually bled off almost immediately. They've found ice on Mercury, and it's almost in the corona of the sun. That's amazing, isn't it?
That is astounding.
Yeah. And the thing about the sun, it's kind of funny too. The corona is actually hotter than the surface by millions of degrees.
Right.
The surface is almost a bearable several thousand degrees, whereas as soon as you get up into the so-called atmosphere, the photosphere, the corona of the sun, it starts heating up by millions of degrees. But none of that heat actually reaches the Earth. None of it. What reaches the Earth is light in the form of plasma. That's what the Anunnaki figured out. Apparently, they figured out how to use plasma to inject consciousness. And if you'll remember, my own personal connection with these solstice lines is, it's an impossibility that I would be brought up, raised on a solstice line that I later write about. Over evidence,
Well,
I've even hiked as a young man to Kitching Peak. I never knew this stuff.
How does this relate to the manna being edible, though? Because I understand what you're saying about the plasma state.
Monatomic gold has different properties. One of the properties is it's anti-gravity, and it also is it becomes a powder, very easy to inject in the upper atmosphere if you needed to, like they're doing with the chemtrails now, around, or at least over the United States. I don't think there's any doubt anymore.
What would be the point of actually eating it, though?
It apparently gave them longer life, and they created it. They used it as an elixir to help them with their. They didn't adapt well. They had a long life, and because of their higher gravity, they started dying off earlier when they adapted to a lower gravity, and they needed this monatomic gold as to allow them to live longer.
Well, I wonder if it was something like a super antioxidant, something that just blocks or reverses. Well, one of my friends,
an author by the name of Gerald Clark. He is one of the leading authorities on the Anunnaki now. He helped me validate the lines in Marfa, Texas. He does work with monatomic gold, and he suggests the same thing that you do. But he has also taken it farther in that he regards the human body as an antenna, and that the monatomic gold helps energize, or helps the conductivity, which I can relate to. Really, they found recent. You have quartz in your brain, apparently. There are quartz particles in your brain itself, and that's just amazing. That's a very, very new find, by the way. That didn't make the book. Neurologists don't really know what consciousness is. They want to equate it with intelligence, but it's not. Consciousness it's pervasive. It permeates, and I think when the Anunnaki tried to explain this to the Aztec and the Inca, they took it wrong. They thought that that blood, and basically the beating of blood was the soul, where the soul was kept. So they'd pull the heart out while it was still beating. They just got the message wrong. This is proven several times. There's a 44-year-old Frenchman who went to the doctors with leg cramps, They did all kinds of tests, blood tests, and everything else. Finally, they did an MRI of his brain and found he had none, or basically 10%, less than 10% of a normal brain. No cortex, no frontal lobe, no nothing. No pituitary, no nothing. He was 44 years old, working as a civil servant in France, and he ended up living a full life into his 70s. This is not an unusual case.
Well,
There are
how do
plenty
you even
of
function
these
without?
cases.
I mean, I can understand maybe
your
a reduction of
consciousness-
brain size.
Your consciousness takes over where the physical isn't necessary. There are people who've had brain operations and had half their brains removed that function as well as before half of their brain was taken out.
Right. Well, it was specifically, you said the pituitary gland, and that I thought, well, that seems like that just as a physiological. Forget about intelligence, but physiologically, isn't that sort of necessary to function?
No, actually, you only need the back area where the brainstem is. That's where all the physical functions apparently take place. Like the heart monitoring, etc. You've heard about the famous chicken that P.T. Barnum had for years without a head.
Right.
It had a brainstem. Okay.
Yeah.
Really, that's all that was necessary for it to be a functioning animal. Isn't that amazing? And apparently monatomic gold helps with your soul. I find that I'm probably allergic to gold, so I don't do it myself. But I would tell anybody, at least try it. You never know.
Well, I mean, is that safe to say? I have no idea.
It has no deleterious function. In other words, it doesn't attach to your kidney or your liver or anything like that. It just you take it in and it comes out of your system. They even put it in rich people's champagne now.
Ah, interesting. Is that for the novelty, or do they know something?
Apparently, they don't. I don't think rich people know anything more than we do. Although, you remember I spoke about the Union Jack of the British flag. That, I believe, emulates the Great Pyramid. I believe that they knew of the connection of the Great Pyramid to Stonehenge. And that's what Sir Francis Bacon was following when he set up the colonization of the Americas. And he was trying to make a new Atlantis. That was a book that he wrote on the colonization. They actually mistook Mexico City as Atlantis. But in Marfa, Texas, there are signs of Atlantis too. Some of the solar patterns that you can see from Google Earth, from the dark lines, there are basically 4 kinds of lines out there, and the dark lines are the ones that you can see from satellite imagery. They form solar patterns that are 10 miles in diameter. Obviously not used for cattle ranching. I've been on a ranch or two myself. There's no function for a cattle corral that looks like a solar array, a solar pattern. There are 7 of these. This is apparently the symbol for Atlantis. And I found other signs that point to Thoth himself, or Quetzalcoatl. He was known under several different names. And my friend Gerald Clark has chronicled all of these Anunnaki names, and his books are very, very readable. If you want to learn about Anunnaki, that's where to go.
So the Anunnaki, do you think that these were humanoid? What is your take on that part of the story?
By the time that the Sumerians started building their cities in Mesopotamia, it was known that these people could change their looks. They were basically shapeshifters. But I believe that they are the elongated-headed race that are found everywhere. And the reason I say that is because we can't be them. And you've heard other researchers say, well, the Greys are us from a future date. Well, no, we can't evolve into them, but we can come from them. They have dense bones. And that fact alone says that there's no evolutionary process that will allow us to develop denser bones unless we went to a higher gravity or at a pressure that our bodies wouldn't live at in the heat. So apparently these elongated headed people are the Anunnaki. They are the adapted Anunnaki, because the recent find of these recent mummies in Nazca, 3 fingers, 3 toes, and none of the organs are in a proper place for humanoid or hominid. They also have very dense bones and a very dense dermis or skin. All of this points to heavier gravity. So the elongated headed people must be the gravity adapted Anunnaki, and they were apparently genetic masters. They were creating all kinds of things to be useful to them out of their own genetic material. And I believe the insectoids, the reptilians, etc., these are all bipedal hominids, basically bipedal hominids, which is impossible if there is any kind of concurrent evolution. It should not be possible. Everything should look different from different planets. So Dan,
in 30 seconds, what conclusion can you share with us?
I want to share that these lines are the paths of gold. And if you want to find gold, you can use this information to actually go exploring. And I did not include a lot of things that I found at pyramidal structures, etc., because I really want people to gain their own bravery like ancient man and cross the open ocean without an archaeologist telling you can't.
All right, I think we'll leave it at that. Dan Hoquist, thank you so much for coming on. I'm glad we actually got to meet virtually, at least. And so if you want to find out more about Dan, just go to dondanel.com, DONDANL.com, and also the same name, Don Danel. Or is it Dan Hoquist for the YouTube page, Dan?
Dan Hoquist for Facebook. I use Don Danel for the YouTube. And you'll find a new series called The Solstice Connection that I'm trying. This is my research that I'm placing up for everybody.
Okay, great. That's it for Paranormal Now on the Inception Radio Network. Thank you for joining us, and join us next week. And, of course, you can always download the previous and post episodes Paranormal Now on the Inception Radio Network webpage. Just go there, click on show, and find Paranormal Now. I want to thank MJ Lucas, Bob Tarmac, and Joe Champion for helping me to make this show possible. And to all of you out there, live in the mystery. Take care.